What are you doing? We got some awesome podcast here.
Welcome back to another exciting adventure of Rethinking Revelation. I'm your host, Travis Finley. This is episode 87, and in this episode we have a special guest. His name is Jay Rogers. Jay and I are acquaintances on Facebook, and he is the administrator of some group that I got kicked out of because I was raising too many important questions on particular issues of biblical interpretation, but that's another sore spot, and we won't get into that lest we detract from the focus of this episode, which is to discuss, in part, Jay's book called In the Days of These Kings. He published this, it looks like, January 8th, 2018 on his website, forerunner.com. It looks like it's available in paperback book, 740 pages, The Book of Daniel in Preterist Perspective. So you can check that out on his webpage, and I suggest you do that. It was a very good conversation that Jay and I had, and I'd love to have him back on to continue discussing issues of preterism and eschatology. I think if you listen to this, you will be impressed by Jay's grasp at history as well as the biblical text. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Okay, so Jay, what I was saying before, let me turn this down. What I was saying before was that we had just some interactions back and forth a few times on Facebook, but never really introduced ourselves. So I was just going to have you do that a little bit for my listeners to know who you are, and then get to know Jay Rogers.
Oh, so you want me to say something about myself? Okay.
Yeah, just a little bit of background. And
let's see. I grew up in Massachusetts, and I was a teacher there, or studying to be a teacher when I became a Christian at about age 23. I got really involved with pro-life activity at the end of the 1980s in Massachusetts. I started writing about it. My cousin and I had a little newsletter, and that kind of blossomed into something bigger. I got invited to join a newspaper in Florida called Forerunner, and Forerunner is run by Maranatha Ministries, and at that time they were publishing a lot of articles by people like Gary DeMar and Gary North and Rushdoony, and I knew that these people taught something called Dominion Theology, and I didn't know what it was. And then over the years I began studying it, and I soon became a postmillennialist because I had rejected the paradigm of dispensationalism, which I learned in an Assemblies of God church, and I felt that was not a very tenable position. And I was looking for something that would explain the book of Revelation, and I just found that David Chilton's Paradise Lost, there was another book that I read called Christ's Victorious Kingdom by John Jefferson Davis, which I think is the best book for anyone that's just looking into what postmillennialism is all about. And that's about 130 pages long. It didn't take me more than a day to read it because it's so readable. And I pretty much understood the position and felt that that's what I was. And so then over the years, I began searching, well, how does this all flesh out? I produced a video with Ken Gentry called Beast of Revelation Identified. Eric Holmberg, Ken Gentry, and I produced it. And at the time I started producing it, I didn't know if I believed everything he was saying, but by the time I was done, it convinced me. So it was an interesting process.
Uh-huh.
And then
let me ask you real quick, how when was that Davis book written?
Davis' book was written in the 1980s, and he was a professor at Gordon Conwell Seminary, and I taught at a school. I taught at a private school nearby. I used to go to their bookstore quite a bit.
Okay.
And that's how I discovered that. I just was looking at books by Gordon Conwell professors, and I had been asking a lot of questions about post-mill, and I happened to see this book that said Christ's Victorious Kingdom, Post-Millennialism Reconsidered, and I said, I got to buy this. I bought it, brought it to the beach, and I like to tell people I became a post-millennialist one afternoon at the beach, so that's how that worked out.
And how did you contact or get in contact with Ken Gentry?
Well, we were at the Ligonier conference, and we had some contact with R.C. Sproul at the time. R.C. Sproul Jr. was a friend of ours, and or a friend of Eric Holmberg's mainly, and we were doing a lot of interviews, and on the way out, we just happened to ask the technician, are you taping any of this? And they said, no, we're not. And we said, well, you should. And they said, all right, I'll put a beta in. And they just handed us a beta, which I thought was very unusual the way that happened. Probably would not happen today. But, we just by providence, we got a hold of the beta tape of the Gentry's presentation, and then we added a lot of what you call B-roll, which is a lot of graphics, and we did an introduction, and we followed it up with an hour of questions and answers with him. It's called The Beast of Revelation Identified, and it's probably one of the best DVDs that you can get on the preterist view of Revelation. It just covers Revelation 13 and 17, but it's a pretty good primer, so I would recommend that.
Okay. Huh.
I started also at that time doing research on Daniel, because what I found very strange was that I had read a lot of books on Matthew 24. John Bray, who you probably know, was one of the first books I read on that. I thought that was his, and his book has changed titles several times, but it was just a booklet on Matthew 24.
Yeah, I think it's called Matthew 24 Fulfilled now.
Right. And then Thy Kingdom Come by Rushdoony, which is kind of a strange book in that it's idealist, but he includes some preterist interpretations of Daniel. And what I noticed was that although there were a lot of books out on Revelation and Matthew 24, I didn't see a lot of books really explaining some very difficult Old Testament books, like the difficult parts of Daniel that no one seems to agree on, or the book of Zechariah, for instance, or the last chapters of Ezekiel. And so I spent really probably the last 20 years writing on that, little bits and pieces. And about 2 or 3 years ago, people had been really pushing me to put some of my articles together into a book form. So I started working on that. And that has become the book. It's called In the Days of These Kings, which is from Daniel 2:44. That's In the Days of These Kings. And then the subtitle is The Book of Daniel in Preterist Perspective.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Preterist Perspective. I have a little cold here, so my voice is going in and out. So.
Oh, no. I can't tell. But, okay. So, with your background with the guys like DeMar and North and Rushdoony, have you read James Jordan?
I have James Jordan's book on Daniel, and it's longer than my book. My book's 740 pages. He has me beat by a few pages. And I've read some of it. I have not read every page of it. And I actually did not order his book until I was well into mine. And I wanted to look at some parts of it to see. I knew there were parts where we disagreed, but we mainly agree. There's a few small items where we disagree, and most scholars disagree on those points. So it's not really that dramatic. It's not really that concerning or surprising that we disagree on those points. So
okay. Yeah, he's got a prolific library, both audio and monographs. That if you find the right time to visit wordmp3.com, which is a treasure trove of Reformed Presbyterian MP3s and, like I said, monographs. Greg Strawbridge is a pastor at a CREC church in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and he's the webmaster for that website. But I came across an end of the year clear out deal, and spent all my Christmas money buying that collection, and that's what turned me on to James Jordan. So I have actually listened to him more than I've read him, but basically it's equivalent in terms of the content. But I highly recommend that if you have the wherewithal to somehow try to. Sometimes the Word MP3 will have a lot of his lectures for free, so you can just stream them. But he does strong exegetical talks and teaching lessons. And you mentioned Zechariah, you mentioned Daniel. He deals with those in a strong biblical theology perspective as well as a preterist perspective. So he's probably been the most influential theologian for me in the past 15 years. And but for what that's worth, I would say continue to read his book of Daniel and whatnot, and then find some other things as well. But his partner in crime is Peter Leithart, and so Peter Leithart I think his commentary on Revelation should be coming out.
Okay, that's good. I met him a few years ago.
Yeah.
And so that's good.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what is what's the primary reason why you felt like, the book of Daniel was where you wanted to start?
Okay, well, there's conservative Christians. We're not talking about liberals now that have a very different view of Daniel in some places, but conservative Christians mainly agree on the large sections of Daniel. Like, for instance, we all agree that the four kingdoms in Daniel 2 are Babylon, Persia, then there's this Macedonian Greek empire that goes all the way through the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic kings down to the time of Maccabees, and then the fourth kingdom being Rome. There are some variations on that, but that's basically it. In Daniel 7, it's the same thing. In Daniel 2, there's a vision of a statue, and the statue is gold, silver, brass or bronze, and then iron. And so the Iron Kingdom is Rome. In Daniel 7, there are four beasts, and each one of the beasts correspond to the same four kingdoms: Babylon, Persia, the Greek period, the Hellenistic period, and then Rome. The same thing with Daniel 8. Daniel 8 is essentially about Persia and Greece. This is after Babylon has fallen, and Daniel is writing about the succeeding kingdoms. Daniel 9 is the famous, which is, you could write an entire series on Daniel 9. It's, there's entire books written on Daniel 9. And mainly, evangelicals agree that Daniel 9 speaks of 70 weeks of years, and they say it started with the restoration of the temple, and usually one or two dates are picked as a starting point. It's either 457 BC or 445, 444 BC, and that depending on how you work the calendar, it brings you all the way up to the time of Christ. I talked to a Jewish man in Ukraine several years ago who had been in a rabbinical school, and he was a convert to Protestant Christianity. And he had said that in the rabbinical schools, the rabbis never read from Daniel 9, which I thought was interesting. They kind of just avoided that chapter because it's if you take it to mean what it says, it brings you to the time of the New Testament when the Messiah would appear. And like I said, there are little variations on how you can start the 490 years, but essentially it's, the restoration period in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, bringing you all the way up to the time of Christ. Then there's the last vision, which is Daniel's fifth vision, and it extends from Daniel 10 which is a vision of an angel, and then Daniel 11 and 12 deal with mainly these two kingdoms called the kingdom of the north and the kingdom of the south. And again, there's very little disagreement there until you get to Daniel 11:36, which talks about this willful king. And then commentators are like all over the map. There's very little disagreement on what happens from Daniel 11:36 down through the end of the book, which is Daniel 12 all the way through 12:13 there. So, and the only other portion of Daniel that's controversial would be who are the 10 kings in Daniel 9, and who's the little horn of Daniel. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I have that wrong. Who are the 10 kings of Daniel 7? I said 9, I meant 7. Who are the 10 kings of Daniel 7? And who is the little horn? And then who is the little horn in Daniel 8? And so I spend quite a bit of the book looking at that. And first I give my opinion, and I spend about 30 or 40 pages on that. Then I explain why. And then the rest of the book is several hundred pages of just historical background and explaining like who all these kings were and why they fit the prophecy.
Okay. So, let's see. What is your overarching hermeneutic that leads up to the book of Daniel itself? Because as I've wrestled through my whole journey in hermeneutics from my dispensational background beginning at age 9 and then going to Moody Bible Institute and then going to Reformed Seminary and then getting turned on to James Jordan and whatnot, I've continued to transform my hermeneutic. And I think that there is a huge absence in traditional and Reformed theology that doesn't take into account something that I think needs to be taken into account, which is an overarching meta-narrative. So my question to you is, in terms of how you approach the book of Daniel as, even starting in Daniel 1, when you are reading the book of Daniel, what is it that exists in your mind as a hermeneutic when you read that book, so that hermeneutic is what drives your interpretation rather than what, if we take Granny Smith, who's my fall character in my podcast, I call her Granny Smith and Grandpa Joe, because they're just the typical Christians who just read their Bibles, and they don't have a strong biblical theology, they don't have a strong hermeneutic, and so they will read through either in their daily Bible readings, they'll come across Daniel and whatnot, but there's something that they are interpreting Daniel through. And so I guess let's just to go back again and reiterate my question. Does that make sense, my question to you?
Yeah, I think what you're asking is, how do we know if the book of Daniel is talking about the end times, or is it talking about history? How do we know what it's pointing to? What's the hermeneutic that would lead us to those conclusions? And, for me, it's very simple. I look at Daniel, and I look at three things. Number one, audience relevance. Who is Daniel, and who's he writing to, number one. Number two will be, what is the historical context of the book and what he's writing about? Like, what was going on? Very few Christians read the Bible with a very good, deep understanding of the ancient history that was going on. We might understand something about the history of Israel, but what do we know about all these nations that he was writing about? So historical context is very important. And then the last thing that's just as important are called time indicators, where there are quite a few time indicators in Daniel. And if you don't pay attention to them very closely, if you don't actually look at what's being literally said, and sometimes there are little Hebrew idioms and metaphors that are used to indicate time, you don't understand what time he's pointing to. So, for instance, when Daniel says that his prophecy is sealed up to the end of time, many Christians will look at that and they'll say, it's about the end times, because look, he's saying the word latter days or end of time, depending on how you translate it. But what he means is the end of the prophecy. Like when the prophecy is fulfilled, people will understand it. So going back to the first point, audience relevance, Daniel is a weird book because it's a prophecy, but it's unlike most other prophecies in the Old Testament. It's similar to Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah in one way, and then it has some historical narrative and prophecy mixed together. Whereas like the minor prophets are mainly prophecies. Okay, Daniel is in Babylon, and the first portion of his book, or at least chapters 2 through 7, are in Chaldean. So he's obviously writing to a contemporary audience. And some people believe that portion of Daniel is what you would call court documents. It was written in a courtly version of the Chaldean language. And then you have the later prophecies, which begin with 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, which are in Hebrew. So that was written as though it was a prophetic book to the Jewish people. Okay? And the prophecies in Daniel, chapter 2, chapter 7, and especially 8 through 12, are meant to point the Jews to trials and tribulations that they were going to have in Jerusalem concerning the temple. And also Daniel, as a prophet, was very concerned about the restoration of the temple and then the final destruction of the temple. That, to a Jew, is everything. That was their entire worldview, was worship based around the temple. Okay? Mm-hmm. And then the last thing would be time indicators, like I just mentioned. You want to look very carefully at, when shall these things be? And Daniel actually asked that question 3 times in chapter 12 and doesn't get an answer that he's satisfied with. But the angels, they insist, they assure Daniel that people aren't going to understand this, but the wise shall understand this. So my question to Christians today are Christians wise? And if so, we ought to be able to understand this. But it just takes a little bit of, like I said. And then the other principle would be that what I spend a lot of time in the book doing is I look at the contemporaneous books with Daniel, like Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, who were more or less contemporary. Isaiah was a few hundred years prior to Daniel, but he wrote about the king of Babylon and some of the same events that occur during the historical portion of Daniel. And then there's an overlap with Daniel's life with Ezekiel. And so a lot of what Ezekiel is writing in the latter chapters is about really the same thing that Daniel is writing, but from a very different perspective. And, portions of Jeremiah are very important to Daniel too, especially about the 70 weeks prophecy. So there are 70 years of captivity, which was prophesied in Jeremiah. And then, so you have to really put it all together. You have to connect the dots. And then every single other book that was written after Daniel has some type of connection to Daniel, even though not all there's perhaps a couple of direct quotations from Daniel and other Old Testament books, which most people are unaware of. And then in the New Testament, Daniel is quoted quite extensively in the Gospels and then very extensively in the book of Revelation. So if Daniel means one thing in Daniel, and then we go to the New Testament and we see Daniel quoted, and we interpret it as being something very different than what Daniel meant, then we're not really being faithful to Scripture or interpreting Scripture. So that's my hermeneutic. It's audience relevance, it's historical background, time indicators, and then let Scripture interpret Scripture.
Yeah, I think that trying to remember the points that I want to bring up. So let's go back to one of the first things that I thought of when you were saying something along the lines of when someone reads in the book of Daniel that his prophecy is sealed up until the end of time, or how did you phrase it?
Well, the language is in Daniel 12. Let me just get there. It's either translated as the end of days.
Yeah, the end of days. Yeah. Right.
Or, Daniel's
because
prophecy was sealed up till the end of days, right?
Yeah.
And then the interesting thing is that when you read John's prophecy, which is the book of Revelation, John's prophecy is revealed, right? So it's the title of John's book is the Apocalypse or Revelation, right? John's book was revealed to his first century audience. Daniel's prophecy was written and then sealed. Even Daniel didn't understand everything he wrote, but John's prophecy was written and sent to 7 living churches. The hearers were expected to have understanding and count the number of the beast. That's Revelation 13:18. John's prophecy was unsealed, Revelation 22:10. And there's no indication that John or his hearers would not understand what Revelation is about. So that's how I interpret that. It's very clear when you put them side by side that, Daniel is saying this is sealed up to the end of days. And then when John says this is now unsealed in Revelation 22, we're supposed to understand that this is the fulfillment, right?
Yeah.
And then it all comes down to how do we interpret the book of Revelation? Is this about the end times or is it about events occurring in AD 70 and so on? So there's also a lot of parallels between them on all of that discourse in Revelation.
Right.
But in order to first recognize Revelation's use of images, it's better to go back to books like Daniel, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Zechariah, and so on. And then after we do that, then we see how those same images line up with Jesus on Olivet Discourse, right? Because his immediate hearers were very familiar with the Hebrew Scriptures. And Jesus even tells them, or at least the writer of the Gospels tells them, that they need to understand the book of Daniel. That's Matthew 24:15 and Mark 13:14, right? And then Revelation makes more use of Old Testament scriptures than any other book in the Bible, any other book in the New Testament. It's it's incredible how much the Old Testament is quoted. I think there's more Old Testament verses quoted in Revelation than there are verses in Revelation. That's what someone told me one time. So you have to really understand the Old Testament first. And so what shocked me was I went back and I looked at the hundreds of books that have been written on a preterist view of Revelation. People might not think that there are that many, but there are. It's in the 19th century there are many books written from this perspective. Philip Schaff's view is that, and so on. And then Matthew 24 as well. But there are actually very few complete preterist commentaries on Daniel. John Calvin wrote one, which I think is the best one. And then there are probably about less than a dozen others between Calvin's time and today that I could actually recommend. And I list them in my book. And so I thought to myself, well, there's more work needs to be done on this, and I hope that my book isn't the final say, that people will read it and it'll give them a little broader understanding and will spur other people to go further.
Yeah. So when you were talking earlier about answering the question about the hermeneutic, you didn't say the end of days. You said the end of time, and then you referenced that most people who read that will think of the end of time rather than the end of Daniel's prophecy. Okay, so then my question would be, in terms of just fleshing that out, pretending that we were in a Sunday school class, and I raised my hand and asked you to qualify how you know it's not talking about the end times, but it's talking about the end of Daniel's prophecy. How would you explain that?
Yeah, first of all, the obvious answer to that is context. You have to look at the context of what's being said. We're from slightly different camps of preterism. I think that there are some end times prophecies in the Bible, but many of the prophecies that people think are end times prophecies are actually about the New Covenant era, or they're about the events leading up to AD 70. And even people, the irony is that even people like Hal Lindsey wrote a famous book called Late Great Planet Earth. It sold I don't know how many millions of copies. I read it when I was a teenager, just like you. I was a little bit older than you when I was introduced to dispensationalism. I think I was 13. You were only 9, so you had 4 years jump on me. But But I got exposed to this, and I was convinced that every time I saw a program on TV where the United States has just sold missiles to Iraq or something like that, that this was, leading up to that prophecy in Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39. It's right in there. It's right in the Bible. And it wasn't because I'd actually read Ezekiel 38 and 39 and exegeted it as a 13-year-old. It's because I read what Hal Lindsey said. But the irony is that even Hal Lindsey in his book, he admits that much of Matthew 24 is actually about AD 70. The Romans did destroy the temple in AD 70, and that is what's being referred to here. What Hal Lindsey does is he proposes a dual fulfillment thesis, which says that it was fulfilled then, but look, we know that all these things like earthquakes and plagues and wars and rumors of wars and people feigning for fear and all these things that are mentioned in Matthew 24 and Revelation didn't happen in the first century in the whole world. That has to be something that's coming up because, there wasn't a worldwide tribulation in the first century. And he's right. There was not a worldwide tribulation. It was confined to the land. So one of the things that happens when people read the book of Revelation is they see the word in Greek, it's called gay, right? And the word gay or gi can either be translated as the land or it can be translated as the earth. It doesn't mean the whole world. If John meant to write the whole world, he would have written the cosmos. But because he wrote the earth or the land, he's referring to Jerusalem. In the mind of a Jew, anyone that was of the Hebrews, of Israel, back in Old Testament time, even up until the times of the apostles, the temple, the city of Jerusalem, and then the land promised to the people of God were synonymous. It was part of the covenant. Okay, so when someone mentioned the land, they immediately thought of the land of Judea or the land of the Jews. And so that's like a big key in interpreting the book of Revelation, is to understand that when John's speaking about plagues on the land, he's not talking about earthquakes that might happen in Florida or Australia. But there were a number of earthquakes that did happen in Judea during that time, and those are documented in Roman histories and also in especially in Josephus, War of the Jews and Antiquities. So there's a connection between those books and Daniel, but what I wanted to do in my book is to show how it all fits together. Like how can we interpret, Revelation 17 with Daniel 7, for instance, because they both talk about a beast with 10 horns. Mm-hmm. So are they the same 10 horns? What's he talking about there? And so on.
Yeah.
So I take the view that the book of Revelation was written during the reign of Nero and the persecution of Christians that began in AD 64, probably very late AD 64, and then lasted until Nero's death, which was June 9th, AD 68. And by that time, the churches of Asia Minor already knew the Gospels. They had at least one or more of the Synoptic Gospels. And I don't think the Gospel of John had been written yet, but they knew about Jesus' Mount of Olivet teaching. So the book of Revelation was sent from Patmos to Christians into the 7 churches of Asia Minor, and it was likely read as a pastoral letter in public meetings, then copied and circulated, and so on. So when they read the book of Revelation, they didn't read it in isolation of the Gospels. They didn't read it in isolation of Daniel and the books of the Old Testament. They were very familiar with Daniel. They were very familiar with other books of Old Testament scripture. Right? In fact, Revelation quotes from the Old Testament more than any other book. I said that. Or any other New Testament book. So since the book of Revelation is directed at specific churches, the readers must have had some background. So I just find it unlikely that the interpretation of John's Revelation has much to do with events later than the first century. Most of the book, anyway. So when Daniel's prophecy was sealed up till the end of days, quote unquote, the end of days, which is the usual translation of that, basically when they read John's Revelation, they understood that this was being revealed. So in my view, there's very little indication that John or his hearers wouldn't understand what that was all about.
Right. Sure. So in your book, did you address in any way, or did you even recognize or notice the focus on the Hebrew terms kate and akari, which are the two terms for days and latter days?
I say in my book, I'm not a Hebrew scholar. I don't know Hebrew. I don't know much Hebrew at all. I know some Greek, but I'm not a Greek scholar either. So I have looked at certain passages that were very difficult in interlinear Bibles. James Jordan is the Hebrew scholar, so he would be the one for that type of exegesis.
Sure, but nonetheless, even in the English, we have I would think one of the motifs in the book of Daniel is latter days and the end. And so all of those things, I think, are clues for us in terms of audience relevance and all of the two other categories that you delineated. So going back to my question that I initially asked you in terms of what your overarching hermeneutic was, I think that the three principles that you gave us are good guiding principles. But I think I would consider those a bit too generic in terms of the answer that I was shooting for, because I mean that's the way that we should interpret each book, right? We take each book in terms of its relevance to its audience. So especially you're talking about the book of Revelation and the seven churches in Asia Minor and whatnot. So that's the audience there, and Jude's got his audience, and John's epistles have his audience, and the book of Romans. So all of those things. So those are general hermeneutical guidelines that I would agree with wholeheartedly. But rather, my question even goes back farther than that. So in one sense, let's say I would take a typological interpretation of Jesus' words in Matthew 5 when he said, "Do not think that I have come to destroy the law, but I came to fulfill it." And he says, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." I take a typological interpretation of heaven and earth. I don't believe that he's talking about the physical heavens and the physical earth. So then I would be pressed to justify what my hermeneutic was in order to interpret what Jesus means by heaven and earth. And then the same thing in Matthew 24 when he says it again, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." Now, Granny Smith and Grandpa Joe are going to see heaven and earth and think that he means the literal heavens and the literal earth. So that when the stars and the sun and the moon come undone in Matthew 24, they are bona fide fundamentalists who literally interpret their Bible. But I don't believe that is the proper hermeneutic. I don't believe that that's interpreting the scripture in a uniform fashion. So then in that sense, what I'm trying to justify to a certain extent is my question to you, because I think that ultimately, even interpreting Jesus' words typologically as heaven and earth presupposes and depends upon even a greater meta-narrative hermeneutical guideline than audience relevance and whatnot. So one of the things that I have been filtering through my prophetic readings and then also the readings of the New Testament is the book of Deuteronomy. I actually think that and in my podcast I've said it a few times, that Deuteronomy 32 is the linchpin for interpreting everything after Deuteronomy 32. So in my podcast, I've said everything after Matthew 24 is about Matthew 24. Everything. Everything after it, all the way through the book of Revelation, is about Matthew 24, basically the Olivet Discourse. So then my statement would then go back to Deuteronomy 32, and I would say the same thing. Everything after everything after Deuteronomy 32 presupposes and depends upon and follows the construction, the construct, the matrix of Deuteronomy 32. So that what informs my interpretation of Daniel is Deuteronomy 32. What informs my interpretation of Jeremiah? Deuteronomy 32. Because in Deuteronomy 32, in Deuteronomy 28, and in Deuteronomy 4, we have an interesting phrase called the latter days. And that is one of the motifs as well that we need to, but even the latter days isn't its own meta-narrative. That's not the meta-narrative. The meta-narrative, in my opinion, is Torah itself. So that Torah is what informs Daniel. Torah is what informs Isaiah. Torah is what informs Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, all of those things. So yeah, as I've wrestled through this, I've tried to piece it together because I always try to think about talking to Granny Smith and Grandpa Joe because I believe they need what I know and what you know. That's why you teach Sunday school or that's why you teach Bible classes and whatever, is because you believe that the people who are in your class need to understand what you understand. Otherwise, they don't understand the Bible to a certain extent. So that when we think about, I think, the traditional and the fundamental approach to the New Testament is that we think that Jesus is bringing a brand new system of salvation that for the entire world. That if we go to the strict fundamentalist route, that the Old Testament was a system of works where people try to keep God's law in order to be saved. That would be one of the first things in a Sunday school class that I teach, that I would say things that aren't in the Bible. Work salvation was never in the Bible. Never, ever, ever. The Jews never tried to keep the law to be saved. And even if they did, what they meant by that is not what we mean by it. So there's a huge hermeneutical shift that has to change. And I think that understanding the nature of Torah itself is key to that. So when we talk about in the book of Daniel the latter days and the end of days or something along those lines, the question then becomes, where did Daniel get that idea? What is he basing his use of that term? He's not creating it whole cloth. This isn't the first time we've seen it, because we see it primarily in Deuteronomy 4, Deuteronomy 28, and Deuteronomy 32. And one of the other things that you said that struck a good chord with me was, see if I can remember how you said it. I think you said something along the lines of, and this is just a rough paraphrase, that the majority of Daniel has to do with the New Testament and the New Covenant. But then there are some that, I think you even said this, that you think that there are some things that are still dealing with the end times.
No, I didn't. Not in Daniel. Not in Daniel. What I said, I think that you're mixing two different things. I said. What I said about Daniel was that Daniel as a prophet was very concerned about the temple, right? His main concern was, is the temple going to be restored? Are the people going to return to the land? Because to a Jew, that was, I don't want to say that was salvation, because that's going to contradict what you just said, but that was their entire worldview. Their entire worldview of how, the way that salvation was administrated was through the temple. We can agree on that. It's not a work salvation, but the way that God administrated the plan of salvation was through the temple. So he was very concerned about how is the temple going to be rebuilt and what is the future of God's people. And then in that, he had a revelation of this Messiah figure that would come at the end of days. And so that's the reason why I entitled the book In the Days of These Kings, because it says throughout the thematic link that kind of binds Daniel together is that in the days of these kings, there is going to come a Messiah, right? And the exact verse goes like this. Okay, it's Daniel 2:44. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to another people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Many people who are futurists read that and they believe that's going to happen after the second coming of Jesus. But if you read literally what it says in the days of these kings, he's talking about Rome. So he's pointing to the time when the Messiah would come. And so those are like the two concerns of Daniel, is that, yes, the temple is going to be restored, but there's still going to be many years, this 490-year period of trials and tribulations for the Jewish people until the Messiah comes and establishes the kingdom. And so that's essentially what Daniel is about. Now, what people will do is they'll recognize that, and then right in the middle of Daniel 7 or in the middle of Daniel 11, they'll make this leap into the end times and start talking about a future Antichrist world ruler and so on. And I just think that that's it's a misinterpretation of Daniel, and it's based in not doing those three things that you think are very, very simplistic. I agree that what I told you was very generic, but you'd be surprised how few Christians use those principles when they read the Bible.
Oh, no doubt. Let me go back and try to be a little bit more clear in terms of what I wanted to address, because I think that you either you were characterizing traditional Christians, or you even said it yourself.
Modern day evangelicals. I'm not talking about the Puritans that lived in 17th century Massachusetts. They may have understood it a little bit better than we do today, but nowadays, Billy Graham just died today. I was watching a lot of stuff on him, and I was thinking about how, Billy Graham is such a colossal figure, but like a lot of my wrong theology came from reading a couple of his books.
Right.
And it's just like, I don't want to say anything, negative towards as great a figure as Billy Graham, but a lot of what, Billy Graham was not a great exegeter of the Bible, but he wrote books on the Bible, and he was one of the people that was responsible for, occasionally coming out and saying that he believed that Jesus would return in a certain number of years and so on. So, that goes to show you, we're coming out of a period where this was almost universal, and now I'm seeing more and more people reject that system, and that they're looking for something. You're on this post. I would encourage people to go on Facebook, if you're on Facebook, and look for a group called Postmillennialism and Eschatology of Victory. Eschatology of Hope, the Eschatology of Hope. And I'm thinking of Marcellus Kick's book. But it's called Eschatology of Postmillennialism and Eschatology of Hope. And I get new members in this group every day. We are up to like over 2,000 and something now. And what that shows me is that there's many people that come on and they say, hey, I'm looking at learning more about this. I've rejected dispensationalism. And I think that that's really starting to happen now with a vengeance. And so it's very important that people are able to answer some real basic questions. What you're saying about, everything being based on Deuteronomy, I agree with that. I think that, I actually talked about this as I was working with an editor who was doing copy editing for my book. And I repeat myself quite a bit in the book because it's 740 pages long. So I find myself repeating things. And I was asking this guy, am I repeating things too much? And he said, well, yes and no, because look at the number of times that the Bible repeats itself. And, he brought out that principle in Deuteronomy, and I wish I had it right in front of me, but there's a verse that speaks about that. And then in Isaiah, it talks about that the people of God are so dense that God has to repeat things line upon line, precept upon precept, over and over and over, a little here, a little there, and bring them through the same pattern over and over again until they finally get it. And then even in Jesus' day, when supposedly it was time for them to get it, very few people got it. And most Jews rejected Jesus, even though it was staring at them right in the page Daniel chapter 9 and Daniel chapter 12. It was right there. And, this is the problem with our sin nature. We're looking through a veil and we're not seeing truth. But what I'm finding now, it's very encouraging, is that people are, like I say in my book, it says the wise shall understand. So are Christians wise? Are we wise enough to actually look at the words on the page and see them for what they mean according to these very simple principles?
Yeah. So what's interesting, again, and you're touching on a lot of good things that are valid for Christians who are coming out of one hermeneutical spiral into another one. Your question that you just asked, are Christians wise? I think that, and where I'm coming from. I think I when I was in that Facebook group that you were the administrator of, there was a lot of my attempts was to be provocative and to say things that were not familiar, because I think that there's a reality of preterism that people don't understand, so that they don't accept the paradigm. It's so funny how The Matrix is the movie to use for so many different illustrations. But you remember when Neo comes out and he's like, it's not possible, and then he throws up. It's just such a paradigmatic shift that people can't make it. But when you said it again for the second or third time about, are Christians wise, I still think that that's a bit anachronistic, but in the reverse sense, because when Jesus finishes the Sermon on the Mount, he calls for wisdom because there's a coming flood. And at the beginning of his Sermon on the Mount, he elevates his words above those of the Pharisees. So, I do not think that I came to destroy the law and the prophets. I did not come to destroy them, but to fully fill them up with meaning, is how I like to say fulfill. But to fulfill them. And then he goes into the delineation. You have heard it said, but I say to you. You have heard it said, but I say to you. But before he says those things, he says, unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will by no means inherit the kingdom. Okay, so right then and there, he's calling for wisdom, because the Pharisees and the scribes are keeping the law. But what ends up happening in the New Testament is I actually want to say it in this way. I want to say that the scribes and the Pharisees who remained apostate knew exactly what Jesus was saying. It would be almost like someone in NASA.
They had an idea that he was talking about them, and they didn't like it.
No. I don't think that they had an idea. They knew it.
Okay.
They knew what he was doing. So let me give you this little analogy.
Well, you can use an example. All right.
So imagine someone in NASA who's been working there for 3.5 years or whatever, comes out one day and he starts talking to people and says, have you ever thought that we actually don't ever see water curve? Have you ever thought that we actually don't feel that the world is spinning? And so he then goes on this preaching tour in NASA where he starts to convert people to a flat earth. And the NASA people go, whoa. There is no way we can let this guy stay and preach. They knew, first of all, they knew and understand what he was saying. So, they knew that it was going to threaten their constituencies. Okay. Jesus comes along and he's saying, I am the end of the law, which is the telos, which is what fulfill is related to. The telos, I'm the end. The law is coming to an end. This whole system is coming to an end. They knew that's what he was saying. But the apostate Jews loved the law more than the end. So the metaphor that I've used in my podcast is the Torah is the yellow brick road. And Jesus in the incarnation is the Emerald City. And if you're on the yellow brick road, you are righteous. So Jesus says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, because they were righteous, they were keeping the law. Okay, they were on the yellow brick road. But the yellow brick road wasn't an end in itself. But that's what the scribes and the Pharisees did to the law. They made it the end. They made it the goal itself. So that when Jesus came on the scene and said that he was the telos, that's where the Pharisees and the scribes stopped walking on the yellow brick road and did not cross over into the threshold of the new covenant. So then when Jesus says, unless your righteousness exceeds the scribes and the Pharisees, so then immediately after he says that, he then goes into an explanation of what that looks like. And at the end of explaining what that looks like, he then gets more explicit and says, he who is wise, right, the one who is wise will build his house upon my words. So that's the wisdom of the New Testament. The wisdom of the New Testament is, whose words are you going to build your house on? Because the end times, the latter days, were coming to their fruition. So the book of Daniel, latter days, end of days, Jeremiah, all of those. So regardless of whether or not you said it about yourself or you said it about the traditional Christians, there was, and I can, because it's a recording, I can go back and find it primarily and play it again. But you did say to a certain extent that you think that there are passages that talk about the end times, which by that you mean for us.
In Daniel, well, let me go back to that, because I think that's, I kind of like to steer the conversation towards Daniel because that's my book. And you had mentioned something about Daniel chapter 12, and you had asked me, why did Daniel use this word? Well, Daniel is not the one using the word; it's the angel, first of all, and the angel is using the words, he's using the words until the end of days. And I believe Daniel understood what he was talking about. He was talking about the end of days that are mentioned in the prophecy. Now, that still doesn't get you out of the pretzel that we have with dispensationalism versus preterism, or futurism versus preterism, because people are still going to interpret that the way that they, according to their own grid. If they see the entire Bible, these passages speaking about the end times, that's how they're going to interpret it. They're going to read that into there. Now, you had mentioned something about the Hebrew word for days, and what were the two words that you used?
There are two words that are primarily in Daniel, and it's kate, which is end, and then akarit, which is latter.
Okay.
So those are the two primary words that we see in Daniel. So whenever we see the latter days or the end, it's always kate and akarit. So it's.
I don't deal with it at all. One thing I do deal with is the word for day, because the word for day in Daniel and throughout a lot of Hebrew scriptures is, and I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but there's a word yom, and also the word yemin, which is usually translated as day, and it also can mean a space of time, and so it could be translated as times. I want to give you like a little example of this in Daniel 10. And this is something that I haven't seen anyone else come to this conclusion on before, but I just thought I was looking at it and I thought it was interesting. This is not something I would be dogmatic about, but I happened to see this, and it's in my book. Okay, there are 21 days that are mentioned in Daniel 10, and it's verses 12 and 13, which is Daniel's conversation with the angel. And then he said to me, "Do not fear, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand, humble yourself before God, your words were heard, and I have come because of your words. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, and behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I have been left alone there with the kings of Persia. Now I have seen all kinds of teaching on those two verses. And especially like if you're, part of the charismatic movement, you get all these teachings on spiritual warfare and so on, that there are princes over kingdoms that are demonic entities and so on. But if you look at what the angel's actually saying, the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me for 21 days. Okay? And look at what was happening at that time historically. All right? From the time of Cyrus' decree, which was Ezra 1:1, and the completion of the dedication of the temple in Ezra 6:16, during the reign of Darius the Great, there was a resistance to the building of the temple. Cyrus' decree was in 537 BC, and then the final completion of the temple was in 516. Okay, you have the prophets Haggai and Zechariah encouraging the people to get it done in the year 520, which is 4 years before that, but the final completion was not until 516. Okay, in between that time, you have three kings. After Cyrus, you have Cambyses, who reigned from 530 to 522. Smerdis Magus, who was like an imposter king, he reigned for less than a year in 522. And then Darius the Great. And Darius is the one who reissued the first degree of Cyrus from 520 and saw the completion of the temple in the next 4 years. Now, look at the math there. All right, there just happens to be a time period of 21 years spanning the decree of Cyrus from 537 BC until the final completion of the temple under Darius in 516. So I said, well, wait a minute. The word for day there is yom, which is usually translated as day, but it can also mean a space of time. And it could also mean times. It could mean months. It could mean 21 days, right? But it could also mean 21 years. Now, what's interesting about that, there are also three kings that are mentioned in when you get into Daniel 11 too. There's three kings, who are Persian kings, that lead up to this time. And it seems to be like linked thematically back to that. So there's this period of time, 3 sevens, right? Daniel had 77s. And prior to that, there's these 3 sevens, or 21 years, in which there was the completion of the temple. And that was prolonged because of the resistance of the Prince of Persia, represented the three Persian kings who ruled after Cyrus. Now, again, I say in the book, I'm not dogmatic about that, but, that's what happens when you look at the text and you're open to like, well, maybe what he's talking about here is not literal a 3-week period, but a 3-time period, and this is an actual prophecy. So I think that this is one of the few things in my book that's unique. I pretty much, for the rest of it, have gone back and followed, looked for other church fathers and people like John Calvin and so on that have said the same thing. I don't believe that there are a lot of new doctrines out there to be discovered, but this is one little thing that I came across I thought was interesting.
Okay, can you just boil that down in a nutshell, because I'm trying to understand.
Daniel says the prince of the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me for 21 days. Okay, and so basically prior to this in Daniel 9, there's a period of 70 weeks, and we understand that to mean weeks of years. If we apply the same hermeneutic to the 21 days, what you would get was 21 years, or 3 weeks.
Okay, so
right,
that's
what
I was thinking in my head. So when we look at the 77s, we look at
right.
70 weeks, but the weeks is that term weeks isn't in the Hebrew.
It just means sevens, and it can mean weeks, but it can also mean 70 weeks of years.
So then how are you...
The word for week and the word for week and the word for seven in Hebrew are the same word.
Right. No, I get that. But guess what I'm trying to go back to is, so in terms of your delineation between Yom and Yamim, in terms of times, right? So it's the time, and half a time.
The word for day there is Yom. It's usually translated as day, but it can also mean a space of time. So what I'm saying is, what if it's not 21 days, but 21 years, which spans the decree of Cyrus in 537, all the way up to the decree of Darius in 516,
Okay.
which just happens to be 21 years.
Okay.
So it's just like one little thing that happens when you're, like for instance, in the book of Revelation, if you're open to the idea that gay might not mean the whole world, but it might mean the land, and then you're consistent throughout the whole book of Revelation.
I think you need to be.
The grid changes, like you said. The paradigm changes. The same thing happens in the book of Daniel. If you take, in Daniel 9, he's talking about weeks of years. And in Daniel, what if in Daniel 10 he's talking about 3 weeks of years, 21 years? Then you would have, and this would make sense because the struggle, what he was struggling with was, when's the temple going to be rebuilt? And then he's basically, the angel's giving him a prophecy saying that it's not going to be for 21 more days. But does he mean days?
Mm-hmm.
So and this is novel, and I'm not dogmatic about it, but this is what happens when you start to be a little bit more consistent with how you interpret certain symbols and things.
Yeah.
I'll give you another example. I can give you another example of this if you're interested.
Sure.
This is one of the most controversial verses in all of Daniel, is Daniel 11:36. And I actually have a graphic of it in my book. And as I'm reading, I'm trying to flip to it right here. Basically, it goes like this. In Daniel 11:36, it talks about the king. You can edit this, right?
Yeah.
All right, the king who does according to his will, right? And people have said that's the Antichrist. They've said it's Antiochus Epiphanes. James Jordan says that it's, let me just look this up real quick, according to his will. James Jordan says that it's Herod the Great. What I found was interesting is the language, okay?
Hey, Jay, hold on real quick. I got to take a call. Hold on.
Okay, sure. I'll give you a chance to find it. So.
Hey, sorry about that.
Okay, yeah, let's do. There's one more thing I want to cover that I think might be interesting, and then you can ask me the other question that you'd like. And I'd kind of like to wrap this up because it's been an hour so far, so that's kind of long for what you're trying to do. Okay.
Oh no, I could do this forever, but yeah, go ahead.
I know. Okay, Daniel 11:36 is the other passage in Daniel that John Calvin says that commentators are literally at sea. He uses that idiom, at sea, meaning that like they're all over the place, they're all over the map. Up until that point in Daniel 11, people pretty much agree on who the different Seleucid kings are, who are the Ptolemaic kings. It's pretty much cut and dried if you go, to a standard interpretation. There's some crazy futurist interpretations of Daniel 11, but pretty much the traditional view is that these are the Seleucid kings and the Ptolemaic kings, and it makes sense. And then we get to Daniel 11:36, which says, "And the king shall do according to his will; he shall exalt himself, magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation shall be accomplished, for that which is determined shall be done." So basically what this is saying is that there's going to be a king that will prosper until God's anger or his indignation is accomplished. And the thing that is determined in the prophecy shall be done, which I say is the final destruction of the temple. Okay, so who's this king? All right, I told you there's different commentators have said different things. Futurists say it's the Antichrist. James Jordan and a few other people say that it's Herod the Great. Liberal commentators say it's Antiochus Epiphanes, and some conservatives do too. But if you look at that language, right, the king shall do according to his will, you actually see that 3 times in Daniel. And then prior to that, you see it in Isaiah. All right, there's a prophecy in Isaiah about the king of Babylon. And most people are familiar with this. It's Isaiah 14. And what happens is that Nebuchadnezzar II is Daniel's first kingdom. And the king of Babylon, Isaiah 14:4, leads into this very famous passage about 5 I wills, right? Thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend toward the heaven. I will exalt my throne against the stars of God. I will sit also on the mount of the congregation in the sides of the earth. I will be like the Most High God. Okay. And so people have connected that to Genesis 3, the original sin of man. Satan tempted man in the Garden of Eden. But the primary interpretation, the meaning of that is that Isaiah is prophesying about either the king of Babylon or the line of kings that came out of Babylon. Okay, Nebuchadnezzar being the first king that conquered Jerusalem from Babylon. Okay, then there's another passage in Daniel, right, about a ram. The ram, I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, southward. No animal could withstand him. So there's this kingdom that goes out. The king goes out. He conquers the whole world. Nor was there any that could deliver from his hand, but he did according to his will. So again, there's another king that did according to his will and became very great. Okay, this is Cyrus the Great of Daniel's second kingdom. And then Cyrus was, there was originally an alliance between Cyrus and the Medes. And soon the Persian Empire became the dominant power. And Persia was a protectorate of Jerusalem. So the Persians treated the Jews pretty well. But Cyrus established that kingdom, and they ruled over Jerusalem. Okay, then another mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. That's Daniel 11:3. This refers to Alexander the Great. Okay, that's Daniel's third kingdom. That's the empire of Macedonia, Greece. The mighty king here is the same as the king of Greece, or the prince of Greece in Daniel 8 and Daniel 10. But here it says, he shall do according to his will. So what you start to see is this idiom. Do according to his will means he can just go out and he can conquer everybody. Right? He's going to do whatever he wants. No one's going to withstand him. Okay, then we get to Daniel 11:16. He shall come against him, but he that shall come against him shall do according to his will, and then shall stand before him. And he shall stand in the glorious land, which is Judea, by which his hand shall be consumed. So there's another prophecy about a king who conquers Judea, and this is Antiochus III the Great. Okay, this is another king of the third kingdom, and this is also Antiochus the Great is also called the king of the north in Daniel 11:15, but in Daniel 11:16 that idiom is used again. He shall do according to his will. Okay, so when we get to Daniel 11:36, there's some time that has passed. If you read 33, 34, and 35, there are 3 time indicators that indicate there's a passage of time. And we see again, and the king shall do according to his will. And I read this before. So what I say there is the kingdom's Rome. And then the king there, who is the king who conquered the world? Who is, the most famous Roman emperor who conquered the world and actually made an alliance with Judea. And that alliance lasted until from the Roman emperors all the way through the Julio-Claudian line, through the Flavian dynasty, and each one of them was declared to be gods above all other gods, supreme rulers of the whole world. Who could that person be? And I say the only one that really fits the pattern, Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus the Great, Alexander the Great, Antiochus the Great, would be Julius Caesar. And so Calvin alludes to that, but he doesn't want to say it's Julius Caesar specifically. He says that it's the whole line of kings, which I agree with. I think that's essentially right. But you can see certain things that occur from Daniel 11:36 through the end of the chapter and into chapter 12, that specific Roman king specifically, Julius and Vespasian, who were the 2 bookends between the 10 kings, that they fulfilled. So that's a good portion of my book toward the end is dealing with what I call the Julian thesis. There's a Herodian thesis that was first presented by a guy named Farquharson, who was a Scottish, and very, very well-known Scottish. James Farquharson was a well-known Scottish interpreter of his day. He lived in the 1800s. And then another guy named James Morrow, who was an American guy who lived in the early 20th century. He was first part of the fundamentalist movement and dispensationalist. He converted over to preterism and wrote a lot of preterist books, and he also used the Herodian thesis. So I critique that in my book. So that's, if people are interested in, some of the real controversial parts of Daniel and how do you interpret them from a preterist perspective, it's called In the Days of These Kings, the Book of Daniel in Preterist Perspective. I'm the author, Jay Rogers, and you can either just Google it or forerunner.com.
I'll get some links and put them in the show notes.
Right, forerunner.com is my website, and it's pretty easy to find there, but it's on Google, and you can read a very extended version of the book on Google Books as well. I think there's 40 or so pages you can read. So, out of the 700-page book, so you can get a flavor of it if you wanted to read the whole thing.
Yeah.
So that's something that people have said this before, but it's just not very well known. And I just think that more work needs to be. People need to be aware of that, and more work needs to be done on that.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. All right, so you're going to give me an opportunity just to have a last follow-up comment, or
sure.
I think what I'd like to say is that the thing that I found myself struggling with as I was transitioning out of a partial preterist hermeneutic was I couldn't justify to myself holding on to a concept of a future end times for us today with the paradigm and the hermeneutic that I was applying for preterism. So I think that preterism as a term needs to be understood in the context of Torah and in the context of the Bible's terminology of latter days and the end of days and all of those things. So that, like you alluded to before, let's say, Grandpa Joe and Granny Smith, when they read their Bibles and they read the end of times, all that kind of stuff, they have one category for that, because the staunch dispensationalists, even though they admit that 80-70 happened in terms of fulfilling Jesus' words in Matthew 24 with the temple being destroyed, that wasn't the end of time. That wasn't the end times. So for your typical churchgoer, every single time they read latter days and end of days, every single time for them, that still means future. They're not preterists at all. Now, the problem that I was suffering as a partial preterist was I couldn't stop myself from going in the opposite direction. And that is that if I'm saying that this is a preterist term for latter days, or if this latter days reference is a preterist latter days, I have no justification for not doing that every single time. There is no justification for saying 5% of the New Testament is still future for us, but everything else is partially preterist. There's no way we can do that. So when we look at Daniel in particular, since that's your book, the latter days and the end of days, what's the context for that? The context is Deuteronomy 32, when God threatens apostate Israel and says to them, I'm going to show you what your end will be. I'm going to show you what will happen in your latter days. So then that has to override everything else, because otherwise it makes no sense that, ultimately in a petulant, childish way, I'm going to say it makes no sense that the entire New Testament is 95% fulfilled, but 5% not. And then when we say, well, look at this term of end times or whatever, this end times is still future for us. It's like, how do you even justify that? But at the very end of Daniel, this is very interesting, and I'm going to leave you hopefully with a cliffhanger, or we can maybe come back and talk about it again. Daniel is told to go his way and lie down, because he will rise up at the end of days. that end of days is the same end of days throughout the entire book of Daniel. So Daniel is told at the end of his prophecy that he will be raised up at the end of days. And so if the end of days is pertaining to Daniel's prophecy, which is sealed up until the end, and then John comes along and unseals it, and we see that the end is going to come about, then Daniel's resurrection is nigh unto the same time as AD 70. I think that that's the only real consistency that we can say about using audience relevance and those other key aspects of interpretation. But what's important, the cliffhanger I want to leave you with was, and this is going to be probably a little bit of like a fire hydrant, because if you haven't thought about it, it'll be a new thought. The end of days. Okay, so go your way and you will stand up at the end of days. Okay. That phrase first happens in Genesis 4. And it's normally translated at the, and it came about in the course of time. But what it literally says is that at the end of days, Cain and Abel came with their sacrifices. And my hermeneutic in my podcast is that the entire the entire Bible is eschatological.
Yeah, I did read that article that you sent to me.
Yeah.
So.
Genesis is eschatological. So the end of days for Daniel is actually the end of day 6. So that those day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, and day 5, and day 6 are eschatological days that lead up to the New Covenant. The New Covenant is the 7th day. So my whole hermeneutic for interpreting what Daniel means by the end of days is Genesis chapter 1.
Right.
So Genesis 1 through the first 6 days are historical eschatological days. So that's the context to understand the end of days, which then goes into Cain and Abel, because at the end of days for them, they are judged according to their sacrifices, and the apostate brother kills the righteous prophet. And then we're told that his punishment is going to be delayed, which is interesting because then when Jesus comes on the scene, he says that Abel is about to be vindicated because he was the first prophet that was killed. And so that goes back to Deuteronomy 32 as well, because God indicts the apostates for killing the righteous. So
it's just in fairness to me, can I make a little comment on this?
Sure.
It won't take that long.
Yeah, you bet.
I want people to understand I didn't come on the podcast to have a discussion about partial preterism versus full preterism or whatever it is that you call your position. But I will say this. One thing that I do agree with you on is that when people read those phrases like end of days and so on, they do actually put their preconceived biases into it. For instance, I don't believe that there's anything in Daniel or anything, even though I believe in the second coming of Jesus, a bodily second coming, there's nothing in Daniel or the entire New Testament, the entire Old Testament, that refers to that. Jesus hadn't come yet. And even when the disciples were asking Jesus questions about the temple, are you coming at this time to restore the kingdom? They weren't asking him when he was coming again, because he hadn't gone anywhere yet. And just a few chapters prior to that, even Peter had trouble understanding that he was going to the cross. So their idea was that the Messiah was going to come as a military leader like Judas Maccabeus, the hammer, and set up a kingdom on earth. And they were very influenced by the Jewish premillennial eschatology of the day, which was called Chiliasm. If you read a lot of these Jewish apocalyptic books, they actually, talk about a period of 500 years or 1,000 years or something like that. And they're drawing that from the proto-apocalypses of the Old Testament. And so what people from the very beginning of the church have been drawn into that Jewish eschatology, which Jesus actually corrected in Matthew 24, but people don't understand what he was correcting. So they make the same error that the disciples are making at that time, thinking that the purpose of Jesus' second coming is to set up an earthly kingdom and so on, when it's a heavenly kingdom that already exists and so on. But we can talk about perhaps this other issue another time.
Yeah,
but
sure,
that's what I want to encourage. I want to encourage people to leave aside your preconceived notions and try to understand what were the hearers of the prophecy thinking, what was the audience thinking, and what was the speaker of the prophecy thinking. And in Daniel, he said Daniel is unusual in that a lot of it he says that he doesn't understand. The angel has to interpret it for him in the later prophecies anyway. So and then when we get to the New Testament and John, the book of Revelation is simply an interpretation of the book of Daniel and many of these other Old Testament prophecies.
Yeah. Okay. All right, Jay. Well, I appreciate you giving me your time. And as soon as your book comes out on audio, I'll be the first one to get it, and I'll be listening to it while I drive.
Okay.
I have absolutely no time to read hardly at all, just because of my driving.
Well, let me give another little plug for my book then. One of the good things about my book is you don't have to read it in order. It's not a traditional commentary. As a matter of fact, I don't comment on every single verse in Daniel, just the prophetic parts.
Okay.
And I do deal with the history, but I don't do what James Jordan does. And James Jordan does something very unique too, but it's not a traditional commentary. If you want that, go to Calvin. That's my biggest recommendation. Is Calvin's commentary on Daniel is the best. But mine is interesting in that you can actually jump around in it, and if there's questions that you have, you can look it up. I have a very extensive table of contents and an index that's useful.
Yeah. Now, tell us, are you teaching somewhere right now?
Yeah, I have taught for on and on. I've run a ministry called Media House International, and it was originally the Forerunner, which is forerunner.com is my website. And I have taught in private schools, public schools, and Christian schools for, trying to think of the exact year, I think 17 or 18 years. So I'm teaching now. And
where are you teaching?
English. It's West Orange High School in Orlando.
Okay.
And I work 6 days a week. So I have time for this. That's why I need to get off the phone and get back to my wife.
Sure. Yeah. You bet. Hey, one last thing, and it's just a plug for a friend of mine who has a YouTube channel where he just finished wrapping up Daniel, and they're about half-hour segments or so. But I'd be interested because he deals with the issue.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that. I'd like to see it. Tell me what it is.
I'll send you a link, but the YouTube channel is called All Prophecy Fulfilled.
Okay.
But
okay.
some of the stuff that you were talking about, I was thinking, I think you would like that or enjoy it. And I think he does a good job. He's a tradesman, and then
my plug is a guy on the Pacific Northwest. His name is Bruce Gore.
Okay.
And as a matter of fact, I could not have done my book without Bruce Gore. He has an excellent book out. It's called, I wish I had it right in front of me. It has a name like Historical and Cultural Background of the Bible, something like that. He's a historian, teaches at a Christian college out in the Pacific Northwest. And if you look up Bruce Gore on YouTube, he's a preterist as well, and he does an excellent job interpreting
I'll have to check that
Daniel, and most other passages in the Bible that deal with fulfilled prophecy.
Okay.
Just like Al Gore,
Jay.
except Bruce Gore. All right, thank you.
Got it. All right. Take care.
All right, that wraps up episode 87, an interview with Jay Rogers, and make sure you check out his webpage, his book as well. And as always, please make sure you subscribe on iTunes or Spreaker and leave a review and a thumbs up and all that kind of good stuff, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And there you go. Until next time.